Which driver has progressed the most through the weekend? Hello, my name is Alex Does F1 Stuff and welcome to part number 3 or episode number 3 of my video series determining who was the best driver of 2020. And today we are looking at which driver has progressed the most or which driver progresses the most throughout the weekend. So if you have not seen the first two parts of this series where I look at qualifying performance and also race performance, I'll pop little cards to those in the corners. Basically, I am giving ranks based on certain types of categories to each driver based on their performance to their teammate as well as their own individual performances, so I get a nice even playing field. And today we are going one step further as there are lots and lots of categories. In qualifying there was 7, which I ranked up nice and evenly, and then in the races there was 8. Ranked out those nice and evenly, and today we are looking at 221 categories. So this video is almost going to be in 2 parts. If you want to just skip straight to the ranking bit, then by all means I'll pop a little time on screen to skip straight there, or if you want to sit through the entire thing where I'm going to sort of visualize each driver's progression throughout all of the sessions, then by all means stick through that. As it does lead in to the categories and how I rank them, I will then also explain the categories as well. So the first bit where I just visualize each of the races and talk about them, it's not particularly relevant to the end, but if you want to listen to that, by all means. I think that's enough rambling for the start of the video. Let's jump on in to which driver has progressed the most through the weekend, and we begin with round number 1 in Austria. So if I just pull up their driver progression, we are going to be looking at free practice 1, 2 and 3, and then qualifying 1, 2 and 3 as well. And if I just map on Valtteri Bottas's lap times throughout this weekend, you can see he progresses nicely and at no point does he lose time from session to session. And then we just map on Lewis Hamilton ahead, and you can see that in Friday, he was actually ahead all the time of Valtteri Bottas, but then it wasn't until Saturday, until qualifying day, where Valtteri Bottas managed to get slightly ahead. And then I just map on everybody else behind this, and you can see we get a nice squiggly wiggly graph with people doing all sorts of random stuff, and then Nicholas Latifi at the top. However, this is a touch on the messy side. I can neaten this up. So if instead we take the team's fastest lap time, regardless of which driver set that lap time, we end up with a graph that looks a little bit like this. We end up with half the lines, but still a little bit messy. And you can see on just one occasion in Q1 that Red Bull's fastest lap time was faster than Mercedes' fastest lap time. And you can actually argue that Q1 was a little bit of a blip for Mercedes, that that dot should be lower, as it would then follow a nice linear progression downwards, but hey ho, that's the way racing goes. Now if I move on into the next slide for Austria, we have a look at each driver's individual progression. Now this is just taking their slowest time, regardless of what session it was set in, subtract their fastest time, again, regardless of which session it was set in. I did debate with myself a lot whether I was going to do it this way, the slowest time regardless of where it was minus the fastest time, as I could have just done their FP1 time minus their Q3 time. So the very first time they set a lap around the track on the first day of the weekend to the last time they did. And I felt that could have worked and we would have had different orders here, but I felt that the overall improvement from their slowest to their quickest time is going to be a better variable. And then we have a second graph here which is a little bit complex to understand, but fairly straightforward and nice visuals. So let me just pull up Mercedes dots first. So the first dot on the left denotes their improvement gains from FP1 to FP2. And you can see it was just around half a second. Then the second dot on the left is their improvement from FP2 to FP3. Then the dot in the middle is their improvement from FP3 to FP1, and then the dot all the way at the top that's just over a second, around 1.1 seconds, is their improvement from Q1 to Q2, and then the dot all the way on the right is their improvement from Q2 to Q3. I can then map on Red Bull's dots and we can see how they compare, and you can see they make much bigger, much more significant gains from FP2 to FP3 learning about the track, and Mercedes hit the ground running in FP1 and progressing further into FP2, but it is Q1 to Q2 that Mercedes make a mammoth leap compared to Red Bull. And then I can just map on everybody else's and it sort of gets a little on the messy side. Now what I expect to see from this graph doesn't always happen. I expect to see the range of the dots from the top dot to the smallest dot to get smaller as we progress through the weekend. As the first session, first improvement from FP1 to FP2, everyone's sort of fine-tuning stuff and still getting used to the cars. Everyone's running slightly different programs. And then in qualifying, and definitely qualifying 3, I expect it to be very close. You expect people to not make much gain between Q2 and Q3, but sometimes that doesn't always happen. And so with this pro forma for the weekend all set out, we will jump straight on in to the next round, and I'm actually skipping straight forward to Great Britain. Now, I'm skipping forward to Great Britain for a couple of reasons. First is that I'm only including Grand Prix in this little segment, not in the actual ranking segment, that have had all 3 practice sessions and all 3 qualifying sessions. So I'm skipping out Styria, I'm skipping out Hungary, skipping out Imola, Turkey, and there was one more, there was 5. Can't remember which one the other one was. And that is mainly because it doesn't really flow with the data. You can't really see the progression, and in the case of Turkey, it looks hideous. But anyways, we jump straight back into Great Britain's progression, and you can see that throughout practice, Mercedes are actually a bit lost within the midfield, and it is Red Bull that have the fastest car so far. But in qualifying, Mercedes just ramp it up again, and then we head on into their driver improvement, and it's actually the 2 Mercedes that have the biggest improvement overall, and then their session-to-session improvements is all over the place. So Mercedes make the largest gains from FP2 to FP3, but then we have numerous teams losing time from Q1 to Q2. We've got Red Bull, AlphaTauri, Racing Point and Williams all losing time from Q1 to Q2. And also McLaren were the only team to lose time from FP3 to Q1. But this does still follow my trend that the range of the dots decreases as time progresses. And then we move on into the next round, and this is the 70th anniversary Grand Prix. Now this one surprised me a lot when I created it. Firstly, to note, we see that Mercedes is just leaps and bounds clear of everybody, and Red Bull is now the team lost within the midfield, as Mercedes didn't actually lose out to anybody, maybe just once in Q2 to Sergio Perez with Lewis Hamilton. But overall, fastest time-wise, they were dominant. But very, very interestingly to note here is that massive loss of time from FP2 to FP3. That really surprised me. Now, this could be to do with the fact that FP1 and FP2 are run on Friday, and then the rest of the sessions on these graphs are run on Saturday. So things like ambient temperature, track temperature could come into effect. And then moving on into the driver improvement section, we see that Daniel Ricciardo actually gains the most time from his slowest time to his fastest time, and every single team loses out from FP2 to FP3. And once again, we see a tendency for the range of dots to decrease as time goes on. They are still fairly close-knit, but definitely FP1 to FP2, they're nice and wide, and then by the time we get to Q2 to Q3, they're nice and together. And then we go to Spain, and again we see a bit of a flat improvement graph with a couple of teams, notably Mercedes, Renault and Haas, actually losing time from FP2 to FP3. However, in the qualifying days, they end up improving all of that again. So it's a very flat practice line, and then qualifying, we end up steeping down. And seeing what this looks like in terms of visual improvements, we see that Gasly leads this just in front of Stroll and also Ricciardo as well, and this is where it gets all a bit over the place. There's lots of people making constant gains and consistent gains, and then you've got teams like Mercedes losing time from FP1 to FP2 along with Ferrari. Then you have a whole heap of teams losing time from FP2 to FP3, and also from Q2 to Q3 we've got 3 teams losing time. Then we head on in to Belgium, and this one is one of the steeper curves there is. I think in hindsight what I should have done was added a range for each track so we can see which one evolves the most and which one each driver goes fastest throughout the weekend on as well. Unfortunately, I didn't do that. But interestingly to note, Belgium was the race where the technical directive for the party modes came in, and we can see looking at the graphs that it was actually Mercedes and Red Bull that get sort of lost in the midfield, and especially the advantage that Mercedes had in qualifying has definitely been sliced. And if we just move on into the progression, we see that it is Hamilton who progresses the most, from Ricciardo once again in the top few drivers, but their session-to-session improvements, that is just all out of whack. I have no idea what's going on with that. We have multiple teams in multiple sessions gaining over a second, and then we've even got teams that are losing time from session to session. Red Bull go from gaining well over 1.5 seconds from FP3 to Q1, but then they end up losing time, or almost losing time, from Q1 to Q2. It's confusing. Then we head on in to Italy. Now, Italy is another one of those shallow improvement graphs, but once again we see the tendency for Mercedes to pull clear from everybody else, unlike in Belgium. And again, Red Bull have slipped further back in that order. And then skipping just to the driver improvement, it is again Daniel Ricciardo who takes the lead in this. And now we start to see the trends, the normal trends that I expect to see for the session to session happen in Italy. Unfortunately, Haas were a bit of an outlier in column 4, their improvement from Q1 to Q2 as they lost just over half a second between those two sessions. Renault lost time from FP3 to Q1, and then also AlphaTauri lost time from Q2 to Q3. Then heading on into Tuscany, we see something that looks a bit like this. Red Bull and Mercedes are massively clear from everybody else, and they're actually sort of fighting with each other. McLaren end up with that ridiculous loss of time from Q2 to Q3, not entirely sure what happened there, and also Lando Norris pokes his head up and loses a lot of time in FP3 as well on the graph on the left. And taking a look at what this looks like in terms of their improvement, we see the 2 racing points take their turn at the top as Daniel Ricciardo slips down that order. And you can see in terms of their progression from session to session that McLaren are that massive outlier from Q2 to Q3, along with Renault and Racing Point as well. And then we get on into Russia, and again we see Red Bull lost in that midfield on the graph on the right. They were never always the second best car on the grid. Interestingly, in race pace, you could say yes, but looking at this data, I wouldn't necessarily say that. They weren't always the quickest car, especially on single lap pace. You can definitely say that Mercedes had the fastest car on pretty much all occasions. There was just once Q2 here that Renault actually managed to beat them, but there aren't many other occasions where Red Bull can definitely say that for single lap pace, they weren't the second best car. Then looking at the driver improvement, we see Lewis Hamilton gain massively as he had some issues in FP1 and was ridiculously slow, but still he managed to gain the most time, 6.4 seconds to 4.4 for Carlos Sainz. And then we head to their session-to-session improvement, and again, it doesn't follow the trends that I expect. And then moving on into another very bizarre looking one. Now this is Portugal. Everyone makes not a lot of gains, actually, from FP1 to FP2 on Friday. Then suddenly, on Saturday, everyone goes mega quick on Saturday going into FP3, but then make no progress whatsoever from FP3 to Q3. We get this very bizarre looking graph, as bizarre as the 70th anniversary. But again, we see that tendency for Mercedes to be the fastest car in all sessions. And taking a look at the visual representation and the driver improvements, it's Esteban Ocon who improves the most, and you can see clearly in column 2 everyone's massive improvement from FP2 to FP3, and then a massive tightening of the range for the remainder of the sessions, as no team is really making any improvements, as the majority of them actually lose time and some of them gain time. It's very interesting, this one. Then we have another shallow graph to look at, and this is Bahrain, the first Bahrain Grand Prix, not the Sakia Grand Prix. And again, we see that Mercedes is definitely the fastest car, apart from FP3. They're slowly losing that advantage towards Red Bull, but Red Bull are still sort of battling with the midfield at the first portion of the race. They definitely don't hit the ground running when they head on into the race weekend. And then looking at the driver improvement as well, we see that Lando Norris leads this one from Max Verstappen and Dani Kvyat, and their Bahrain team session-to-session improvement, we see that Williams lose masses and masses of time from Q1 to Q2. George Russell's Q1 time was uber quick, and then his Q2 time was not so quick. But again, we do see the trends that I expect. The range of dots decreases as the sessions go on. And then moving on into the Sakia Grand Prix, we end up with, again, a very shallow graph. Now, unfortunately, I haven't put the ranges on, so you can't really see this, as most of the graphs look the same as I changed the axes so we see the most clarity in the lines. So if I would have put a range on, you could easily compare them. That is something that I should have actually done in hindsight. But we go back to this, it is definitely shallow, and you can see now is the race that Mercedes have lost their advantage. they are clearly, if you look at the graph on the right, no longer the fastest car on single lap pace for every session like they have been for the majority of the season. It is Bahrain and Sakia that is the turnaround point. And then looking at the driver improvement for this weekend, it's actually Aitken and Latifi, the two Williams, who gain the most, as once again we see the trend follow its normal expected path in my brain. We see that the tightening of the dots as the sessions go on. And then finally we take a look at Abu Dhabi, and once again Mercedes are clearly not the fastest car on single lap pace, as both actually struggled in FP3. They had an unexpected slow turn. Compared to Red Bull, who were a nice sort of shallow decrease in time, Mercedes were on a nice projected shallow decrease in time, but then FP3 poked up into the midfield. Very interesting. And then in terms of driver improvement and session-to-session improvement, it's the two McLarens that lead this one from Charles Leclerc, and once again we see the final tightening of the dots as the sessions progress. Now, with that all done and dusted, and we've taken a look at all of the races, I now need to discuss the ranking. So welcome to all of those people that have just joined me from skipping ahead for the bits that aren't necessarily necessary to this section of the video. So like I said in the intro, there are 221 categories that we are scoring the drivers on, and these are based off of gaps to your teammate in each session, and also the gaps to your average session position. So this category doesn't bias teammates who have a large advantage over one another, or teammates that are super close, as yes, it does look at teammate battles, but it also looks at your individual battles as well, your own individual improvements. So let me just discuss the categories now. We have the 17 races. I will be scoring individual categories on the 17 races. They are what I've called the mini categories. The 17 races are the mini categories, and the 17 mini categories make up the driver progression category. And then within each mini category, there are 3 micro categories. And then micro category number 1 involves six macro categories. So let's go on into micro category number 1, your gap to your teammates in each session. And we pull up the macro categories within micro category number 1, and this is your FP1 gap to your teammate ranked from left to right. And you can see that Grosjean and Magnussen are zeros. They are not ranked in this macro category, as one driver did not set a time, and this is data for Austria. So one driver in Haas did not set a time, so therefore there is no gap to take for either teammate, so they will not be ranked in this macro category. Macro category number 2 is the FP2 gap to your teammate. So George Russell was almost a second ahead of Latifi, as Latifi was almost a second down, and we end up with this nice bow shape. Then we've got the FP3 gap to your teammate, which once again George Russell is leading with Nicholas Latifi at the back. Then we've got the Q1 gap to your teammate, all the way down to Alex Albon at the bottom. And then just skipping ahead towards the next couple of categories, we have the Q2 gap to your teammate and the Q3 gap to your teammate. So once again, within these 6 macro categories, the drivers that score a 0 are not ranked, so they are not included. So they don't receive a 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 rank or anything like that. They are just excluded from the ranks, creating the micro category for the teammate gap advantage. Then micro category number 2 within the mini categories is again formed of 6 macro categories, and this looks at your individual improvements, your individual performances. So throughout the season, I have worked out each driver's average position in FP1, each driver's average position in FP2, FP3, Q1, Q2 and Q3. Now obviously there are some drivers that don't have an average position in Q3 and Q2 as well, and therefore, I banged my desk, therefore they will not have a rank within these 6 macro categories if it comes up. And then with that average, I will then subtract their position in FP1 from their average, and we see how they have performed against it, and once again that's ranked from left to right. And if I just pull up the first 4 macro categories within this one, we have the FP1 position difference to your average position. So Carlos Sainz and Lando Norris were 7 and 6 positions ahead of their average FP1 slot, compared to Gasly and Kvyat, who were 7 and 9 positions behind their average FP1 position. FP2 is led by Sebastian Vettel, with Gasly again at the back, and then FP3 is again led by Sebastian Vettel, with Sainz at the back. Q1, Lance Stroll leads from Esteban Ocon all the way at the back, and then the last 2 macro categories look something like this. So once again, the drivers with zeros at the end of the table on the right hand side will not have a rank for this macro category. And again, I feel it's important to say at this point, drivers with equal values receive a joint rank. So the ranks will not be descending, they will have joint ranks. And then finally, we take a look at the second micro category, which forms up the mini category of the race, and that is the driver's improvement. There are no macro categories with this, so no need to worry whatsoever. Again, it is ranked from left to right, and this is your slowest time minus your fastest time. So just to recap, there are 13 overall categories that make up each race category. Then there are 17 race categories, and each race category is averaged to form the driver progression average. Hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully you're not entirely lost. But if you would like an explanation, then please let me know in the comments below, and I'll work on making an explanation video of exactly how I've gone about ranking each of these. But after I have done that, I create a graph that looks a little something like this. So this is the ranks for the 17 mini categories. So your ranking per race, it is then these 17 categories and your position in this that is then averaged out to form the ranking for the driver's progression category. And you can see that position 1 is at the bottom and position 20 is all the way at the top, and it gets very, very messy very, very quickly. But we are almost at the end as the Alfa Romeos get filled in, and then we've got the Haas cars coming in, and then finally we have the 2 Williams cars, with Nicholas Latifi actually scoring a P1 in Sakia as well for their mini category score. And with the 17 mini categories all ranked, I end up with an overall position graph that looks something like this. So we have the drivers' ranks for their progression overall. Max Verstappen ends up leading this with a 4.65 average from Lewis Hamilton, from Lando Norris, from Charles Leclerc, from Valtteri Bottas, then Ricciardo, Sainz, Gasly, Russell, Perez, Stroll, Ocon, Raikkonen, Magnussen, Albon, Kvyat, Vettel, Grosjean, Giovinazzi, and Latifi at the back. And there we go, it is as simple as that. 221 categories all done and dusted, and we have one simple order. Now, if you have disagreed with anything that I've said or would like to improve upon all of this mathematics, then please let me know down in the comments below. My email is also down there as well if you don't feel like leaving a public comment. But just one last thing from me, these categories are all entirely subjective. I can change them, I can change the way I rank them, I can change the way I score them, I can change what I look at, and this order will change. So please don't take this too seriously, it's just my interpretation of trying to quantify, trying to put a number, rather than giving my own opinion on a driver and their driver's performances. I want to try and associate numbers to it. I like working with numbers. But there we go, that is it for episode number 3. Join me hopefully soon for the race progression, the final category, and then I'll give a 5th video in this series that ranks those 4 main categories together. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.